The Apollo Theater in Harlem stood like a monument to dreams on the evening of March 14, 1974. Outside, the March wind carried the last remnants of winter through the streets, rattling the marquee that announced amateur night, a tradition that had made and broken careers for generations. Inside, the theater buzzed with the particular energy that came from knowing that anything could happen, that in the next few hours, someone completely unknown might step onto that stage and change their life forever. The seats filled slowly at first, then all at once, a rush of people seeking warmth and entertainment and the possibility of witnessing greatness before it became famous. In the third row sat a group of music executives from Motown Records, men in expensive suits who had seen everything, heard everything, and prided themselves on being impossible to impress. They had come tonight not to discover new talent but to support a charity event, to be seen, to network, to check a box on their social calendars. They sat with their arms crossed, their expressions already bored, already dismissive of whatever amateur acts would parade across the stage. The host, a man whose voice had introduced thousands of performers over the decades, stood in the wings reviewing his notes, making sure he had the names right, the ages correct, the hometowns memorized. He had learned long ago not to get excited about any single performer because most of them would disappoint, most would prove that talent was not enough, that stage presence could not be taught in time for one night at the Apollo. Backstage, in a dressing room barely large enough for 3 people, Michael Jackson sat on a wooden chair that wobbled when he shifted his weight. He was 15 years old, though he looked younger, his frame still caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence. He wore platform shoes that added 3 inches to his height, bell-bottom pants that his mother had altered twice to get the fit right, and a sequined vest that caught the light from the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. His brothers, the other members of the Jackson 5, had performed earlier in the week at a different venue, but tonight Michael was alone, having volunteered for this amateur night as a personal challenge, a way to prove to himself that he could command a stage without the safety net of his siblings surrounding him. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the lyrics in his mind, running through the choreography he had practiced in his bedroom mirror for hours each day. He could hear the muffled sounds of the current performer finishing their set, could hear the polite but unenthusiastic applause that greeted the end. In 5 minutes, he would be on that stage. In 5 minutes, everything would change, though he did not know it yet. A stage manager knocked on the door and called his name, telling him it was time, and Michael stood up, straightened his vest, and walked toward the stage with a confidence that his trembling hands contradicted. The host introduced him with the perfunctory enthusiasm of someone who had already decided this performance would be forgettable. Ladies and gentlemen, our next performer is 15 years old. From Gary, Indiana, please welcome Michael Jackson. The applause that greeted this introduction was polite, nothing more. The Motown executives in the third row did not even look up from their conversation. One of them was telling a story about a recording session, his voice loud enough to be heard several rows back, completely unconcerned that a performer was taking the stage. Michael walked to the center of the spotlight, and the first thing people noticed was how small he seemed, how young, how unlikely it was that this child could deliver anything worth remembering. Someone in the balcony laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, the kind of laugh that says this will be amusing but not impressive. That laugh carried through the theater, and several other people joined in, a ripple of low-level mockery that Michael could hear clearly from where he stood. He did not react. He simply waited for the band to start, his eyes closed, his breathing steady despite the fear that threatened to paralyze him. The piano played the opening notes, a familiar Motown melody that the audience recognized immediately, and there was another wave of laughter because everyone knew this song, everyone had heard it performed by professionals, and the idea that this child thought he could do it justice seemed almost adorable in its naivety. Then Michael opened his mouth and sang the first line, and the laughter stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. His voice cut through the theater with a clarity and power that seemed impossible from someone his size, his age, his apparent youth. It was not just that he could sing the notes, though he could, hitting each one with perfect pitch and remarkable control. It was that he understood the emotion behind the lyrics, that he could convey heartbreak and longing and desperate hope in a way that made every person in that audience forget they were listening to a teenager. The Motown executives stopped their conversation mid-sentence. One of them, A man named Richard, who had been in the music industry for 25 years and thought he had heard every variation of talent imaginable, actually stood up from his seat, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open. The woman next to him grabbed his arm and whispered something, but he did not hear her because he was completely absorbed in what was happening on stage. Michael had not moved from his position at center stage. He stood perfectly still, his eyes still closed, his entire being focused on the song, on the story he was telling through the lyrics. No choreography, no dancing, no tricks or gimmicks. Just his voice, pure and powerful and absolutely undeniable. The second verse came and Michael's voice grew stronger, more confident, as if he was feeding off the shocked silence of the audience. He began to move now, not the elaborate choreography he had practiced but something more organic, more natural. His body responding to the music in ways that looked completely spontaneous but revealed years of study, years of watching every performer he could find, absorbing their movements and making them his own. His hand reached out to the audience, his fingers spread wide, and that simple gesture carried so much emotion that several people in the front rows felt tears forming in their eyes without quite understanding why. The band behind him began to play with more energy, responding to what Michael was giving them, feeding off his performance the way he was feeding off their music. The drummer, a session musician who had played the Apollo hundreds of times, would later say that he had never felt anything like it, that Michael had somehow taken control of the entire room without saying a word, without acknowledging the audience directly, simply by being completely and totally present in the music. The tempo increased and Michael's voice rose to meet it, hitting high notes that seemed to float above the music before descending back into the melody with perfect precision. Halfway through the song, Michael opened his eyes and looked directly at the audience, and the connection was electric. People gasped, not because of what they saw but because of what they felt, that sensation of being seen, being understood, being part of something larger than themselves. Michael's eyes scanned the crowd, not nervously but with complete command, as if he was taking measure of every person in that theater and deciding what they needed from this performance. When his gaze passed over the Motown executives in the third row, Richard felt something he had not felt in years: genuine surprise. This was not amateur night talent. This was not a promising young singer who might develop into something special with years of training and experience. This was a fully formed artist, someone who already understood performance at a level that most people never reached even after decades in the industry. The song built toward its climax, and Michael's voice built with it, each note more powerful than the last. Each phrase delivered with increasing intensity until it felt like the entire theater was vibrating with the force of his performance. His body moved in perfect synchronization with the music, spins and steps that he had practiced 10,000 times but that looked completely effortless, completely natural, as if he had been born knowing how to move this way. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These untold moments from music history deserve to be remembered and shared with the world. The final note hung in the air, sustained far longer than seemed humanly possible, Michael's voice holding it steady and pure while the band played the last few bars beneath him. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Michael stood center stage, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his sequined vest catching the spotlight and throwing fragments of light across the first few rows. The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, an eternity in performance time. Then the Apollo Theater erupted. The sound was not applause, not yet. It was a roar, a collective expression of shock and joy and recognition that what they had just witnessed was extraordinary. People jumped to their feet, not in a gradual wave but all at once, as if a signal had been given. The standing ovation was immediate and unanimous, from the skeptics in the balcony who had laughed at the beginning to the music executives in the third row who were supposed to be impossible to impress. Richard was clapping so hard his palms hurt, tears streaming down his face without shame or self-consciousness. The woman next to him was screaming, actually screaming, her voice joining hundreds of others in a cacophony of appreciation and disbelief. Michael stood perfectly still, absorbing the reaction, his face showing something between surprise and relief and triumph. He had known he was good. He had practiced until his voice was hoarse and his feet were blistered. But knowing you are good and having an entire theater confirm it are two different experiences. and the emotion of that confirmation washed over him in a wave that made his knees weak. He bowed, a simple gesture, his hand over his heart, and that bow somehow made the applause even louder. People were crying openly now, not just individuals but entire rows. Something about the performance had touched a nerve, had accessed an emotion that people kept locked away in their daily lives but that music could still unlock. The host ran onto the stage, his prepared remarks forgotten, and he simply stood next to Michael with his arm around the boy's shoulders, shaking his head in amazement while the ovation continued. It went on for 90 seconds, then 2 minutes, then longer, people refusing to stop clapping, refusing to let the moment end. The stage manager in the wings knew he needed to move the show along, knew there were other performers waiting, but he could not bring himself to signal for them to stop, because he too was crying, because he too understood that what had just happened was rare and precious and deserved every second of acknowledgement it was receiving. When the applause finally began to fade, when people slowly started to sit back down, their hands still moving in scattered bursts of clapping, Richard from Motown was already moving. He pushed his way out of his row, not rudely but with purpose, and headed backstage while the next performer was being introduced. He found Michael in that small dressing room, sitting on the same wobbly chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. For a moment Richard thought the boy was crying from distress, but then he realized these were tears of relief, of joy, of release after holding so much tension for so long. Richard knocked softly on the door frame even though the door was open, and Michael looked up, wiping his eyes quickly, trying to compose himself. Richard walked into the room and knelt down so he was at eye level with this 15-year-old who had just delivered one of the most powerful performances he had ever witnessed. He did not offer a business card. He did not pitch a recording contract. He simply said, "I want you to know that what you did out there was not just good. It was not just impressive for your age. It was perfect. It was the kind of performance that people will talk about for the rest of their lives. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Michael nodded, but Richard could see he did not fully understand, could not fully grasp the magnitude of what he had accomplished. How could he? He was 15 years old, still living at home, still sharing a bedroom with his brothers, still trying to figure out who he was separate from his family. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card, then thought better of it and put it back. Instead, he took off his watch, an expensive piece that he had received as a gift when he produced his first #1 record, and he held it out to Michael. "This watch has been with me through every important moment in my career," he said. "I want you to have it. Not as payment, not as a bribe to sign with Motown, but as a reminder. When you doubt yourself, when you wonder if you belong on stage, I want you to look at this watch and remember tonight. Remember that a room full of strangers, including people who thought they could not be impressed, stood up for you. Remember that you made them feel something real." Michael took the watch with trembling hands, looking at it like it was made of light rather than metal and glass. He tried to say thank you, but the words caught in his throat, so he just nodded, and Richard understood perfectly. The story of that Apollo performance spread through Harlem like wildfire. People who had been there told people who had not, and the retelling grew with each version until it took on mythical proportions. But even the exaggerated versions did not do justice to the reality of what had happened. In the days that followed, people returned to the Apollo asking when Michael Jackson would perform again, not understanding that he had only signed up for that single amateur night, that he had returned to Gary, Indiana, to continue his life as a relatively unknown teenager. The Motown executives, all 5 of them who had been in that theater that night, held an emergency meeting to discuss what they had witnessed. They pulled every string they could to track down Michael's family, to reach out to his father, to begin the process of bringing him into the Motown system. But this proved unnecessary because the Jackson 5 was already on Motown's radar, already in discussions about a recording contract. What that Apollo performance did was accelerate the timeline, convince the label that they could not wait, could not risk another label discovering what they had found. Within weeks, the Jackson 5 was in a Motown recording studio, and Michael was being positioned not just as a member of the group but as the centerpiece, the voice that would define their sound. But Michael never forgot amateur night at the Apollo. He kept Richard's watch in a special box, and he wore it only on significant occasions, days when he needed to remember who he was and what he was capable of. The watch became a talisman, a physical reminder of the night when he transformed from a talented kid into a recognized artist, from someone people laughed at into someone who could make an entire theater rise to its feet. Years later, when Michael was performing in stadiums, when his face was recognized around the world, when he had redefined what it meant to be a pop star, interviewers would sometimes ask him about his earliest memory of feeling like a real performer. He would smile that enigmatic smile and tell them about the Apollo, about the laughter at the beginning and the standing ovation at the end, about how the distance between those two reactions was only 3 minutes but felt like a lifetime. He would talk about learning that you could not control how people saw you at first, you could only control what you gave them once they started paying attention. That lesson, learned at 15 in a Harlem theater on a cold March night, would guide him through the rest of his career. The wooden chair from that dressing room was eventually retired and placed in a small museum dedicated to Apollo theater history. Someone had written on the back of it in permanent marker, "Michael Jackson sat here, March 14, 1974. People visiting the museum would stand in front of that chair, some of them not even sure who Michael Jackson was when he was 15, trying to imagine that moment before fame, before everything changed, when he was just a nervous kid in platform shoes waiting to prove himself. The chair became a pilgrimage site for young performers, people who would come to the Apollo hoping to replicate what Michael had done, hoping to transform skepticism into applause in the space of a single song. Most did not succeed because most could not, because what Michael had done that night required not just talent but timing, not just skill but the courage to stand in front of people who did not believe in you and give them no choice but to change their minds. The chair remained in that museum as a reminder that greatness often begins in small rooms, that legends are not born fully formed but are created in moments of risk and vulnerability and absolute commitment to your art. Richard kept a recording of that performance, an amateur audio tape that someone in the audience had made on a portable cassette recorder. The quality was terrible, all distortion and background noise and the muffled sounds of people talking, but Michael's voice came through clearly enough, powerful enough, emotional enough to make Richard cry every time he listened to it. He played that tape for young artists who came to him looking for advice, wanting to know how to make it in the music industry. He would tell them the story of the 15-year-old who walked onto the Apollo stage to laughter and walked off to a standing ovation, and then he would play the tape, and they would hear it for themselves, that voice that could not be denied, that presence that could not be ignored. Some of them understood what they were hearing. Others could not appreciate how rare and special that kind of talent was, how unlikely it was that they would ever possess it themselves. But Richard played the tape anyway, believing that even if only 1 out of 10 young artists truly understood, truly absorbed the lesson, it was worth it. The lesson was simple. Talent without courage is potential without impact, and the world is full of talented people who never found the courage to step onto a stage where people were laughing at them. The audience members from that night became custodians of the story, each one adding their own details, their own perspective, their own emotional truth to what happened. A woman named Dorothy, who had been sitting in the balcony, told her grandchildren about it every year on Michael's birthday. She would describe how the laughter had made her angry, how she had wanted to stand up and defend this young performer before he even started singing. She would describe the first note, the way it seemed to silence not just the audience but the entire building, the entire neighborhood, as if all of Harlem had stopped to listen. She would describe the tears, her own and everyone around her, and how she had not understood why she was crying until years later when she realized she had been witnessing the birth of something extraordinary, the moment when talent became destiny. Her grandchildren would listen to this story with varying degrees of interest, some fascinated, others bored, but all of them remembering it later when they heard Michael's music on the radio, when they saw him on television, when they tried to reconcile the global superstar with the 15-year-old boy their grandmother had seen in a Harlem theater. Michael's brothers heard about the performance from him directly when he returned home to Gary. They sat around the kitchen table while he described every detail, the laughter, the fear, the moment when his voice took over and he stopped being nervous and started being present. His brothers listened with a mixture of pride and envy, because they were a group, they were the Jackson 5, but they could see that Michael had something beyond what the group possessed collectively. His mother, Catherine, listened from the kitchen doorway, her hands folded in her apron, her eyes bright with tears that she refused to let fall. She had always known Michael was special, had always seen something in him that went beyond normal childhood talent, But hearing him describe this Apollo performance confirmed what she had suspected. Her son was not meant for a normal life. He was meant for stages and spotlights and the kind of attention that would transform him into something larger than a single person. The thought terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure, because she wanted greatness for her children, but she understood the cost of that greatness, the sacrifices it would demand, the ways it would change them and their family forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories about the legends who shaped music history. Your support helps us continue sharing these incredible moments that deserve to be remembered. The Apollo Theater continued to host amateur nights for decades after Michael's performance, and every now and then, someone would deliver a performance that reminded the older audience members of that March night in 1974. They would turn to each other and whisper, "Remember Michael Jackson?" And they would smile, sharing the memory like a secret, like proof that they had been present for something significant. But no performance ever quite replicated what Michael had done, because no other performer faced the same combination of circumstances. The skepticism, the laughter, the youth, the courage, and the undeniable talent that made skepticism impossible to maintain. The Apollo became part of Michael's mythology, one of the foundational stories that explained how a kid from Gary, Indiana became the king of pop. The theater embraced this connection, eventually dedicating a plaque to Michael's performance, placing it in the lobby where everyone could see it when they entered. The plaque was simple, just his name, the date, and the words, "A star was confirmed." Not born, but confirmed, because the talent had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. Richard's watch, the one he had given to Michael that night, eventually made its way to a museum after Michael's death. The Jackson family donated it along with other personal items, and it was displayed in a case alongside the iconic glove, the fedora, the military jackets that Michael had made famous. But the watch attracted a different kind of attention than the performance pieces. People would stand in front of it reading the placard that explained its significance, and they would understand something fundamental about Michael's journey. The glove and the costumes represented the peak of his fame, the fully realized version of his artistic vision. But the watch represented the beginning, the moment when he proved to himself and to the world that he belonged on stage, that he could command attention and respect and emotional connection through nothing but his voice and his presence. Visitors to the museum, especially young performers who came seeking inspiration, often spent more time looking at the watch than at the more famous artifacts, because the watch represented possibility, the idea that greatness could emerge from humble circumstances if you had the courage to step onto a stage where people did not believe in you. In the years before his death, Michael rarely spoke about that Apollo performance unprompted, but when interviewers asked him about moments that shaped his career, he would sometimes mention it, always with a slight smile, always with a tone that suggested he was accessing a memory that remained vivid and powerful decades later. He would describe the laughter and the fear, but he would emphasize more the lesson he learned that night. That an audience's initial reaction means nothing, that you can change minds and hearts if you commit fully to your performance, if you give people no choice but to reconsider their assumptions. This lesson served him well throughout his career, during moments when critics dismissed him, when competitors underestimated him, when the industry tried to put him in a box that was too small for his ambitions. He would remember that Apollo audience, remember their laughter turning to applause, and he would find the strength to continue being exactly who he was, regardless of what anyone else thought. The final image, the one that people carried with them when they finished telling this story, was not of Michael on stage taking his bow. It was of him in that dressing room afterward, holding Richard's watch in his hands, looking at it like it contained all the answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. That image, whether people had witnessed it directly or simply imagined it based on the story's details, represented something essential about ambition and validation and the journey from doubt to certainty. Michael had walked into that Apollo theater as a talented kid hoping to prove himself. He had walked out as an artist who had been confirmed, witnessed, and validated by people who had no reason to believe in him except the evidence of what they had experienced. That transformation, from seeking approval to receiving it, from hoping for recognition to earning it, was what made the story powerful, what made it worth remembering, what made it relevant to anyone who had ever stood at the beginning of something important and wondered if they had what it took to succeed. Michael had what it took, and on that March night in Harlem, when he was just 15 years old and people were laughing at him, He proved it beyond any possible doubt.